Dear audience, welcome to Faces of Digital Health, originally a podcast about digital health and how healthcare systems adopt technology. My name is Tjasa Zait, and today you're going to hear a few things that science has uncovered about pain and how pain is researched in the first place. I spoke with Sara Berger, a researcher at IBM. Sara has over a decade of experience in the pain field. Her background includes neuroscience, psychology, bioethics, and women, gender, and sexuality studies. We talked about how science defines pain in the first place, how can pain be quantified given the variety of factors that impact it, and how does research so far translate into the clinical practice. Enjoy the discussion, and if you would like to read about other episodes as well, go to www.facesofdigitalhealth.com. To see more discussions, subscribe and browse through this YouTube channel. But if you want to just listen, find Faces of Digital Health wherever you listen to your podcasts. Now to Sara. Okay, so Sara, for starters, how does science define pain, since pain is a very personal and subjective matter? So I wonder how diverse the definitions are in the research space.
Right. So the International Association for the Study of Pain, they define it both in terms of a sensation and a perception, as well as an emotion. And they also importantly define pain in terms of both actual tissue damaged or also potential tissue damage. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they've even revised this definition or added to it very recently, like last year. And they include things about culture, communication, psychology, and they also make a very clear distinction between what we call nociception, which is the actual cellular activity of receptors in response to noxious stimulation, and then pain, which is this much bigger, broader perception, sensation, and emotion. So I think because this is an international definition, I think the actual definition is pretty much agreed upon, but there's obviously various ways of studying or lens of looking at pain that can differ substantially, right? So culture matters, whether or not you're looking at the brain or the spinal cord in response to pain. These types of things kind of color the way that people study it, but not necessarily how you define it, right? So I think there's an agreed upon definition, but you can study it from various aspects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of aspects of it, which makes sense. But, before we dive into the research and the reasons why placebo works in some people as good as a drug, I want to dig into the understanding of pain a little bit better. When I was doing the research, my first thought was, yeah, obviously there has to be a way to quantify pain. But then you dive into literature a bit, and then you realize that, yeah, maybe some people that are constantly in pain, they become a little bit tolerant to the pain. So, if you would ask them, how would they rate their pain? It would be different from somebody else. It's different if you're scared or not. So how difficult it is to actually be objective and to actually quantify pain, quantifying pain when you're researching it.
You're bringing up wonderful points. So first of all, the one thing that you touched on is that there's a difference between acute and chronic pain, right? So acute pain is like this idea where we, slam a door and we hurt our finger, or, stub our toe or something. And this is fast pain. This can last, seconds to minutes, maybe an hour or so. And, it's really about tissue damage. And the ways that we respond to that are actually physiologically and psychologically quite different than something called chronic or like long-term pain, right? And so, as you said, over time, people learn, and not just learn in terms of being like cognitively aware of this learning, but they're all these different chemical, physiological, and psychological signals, right? Which makes the chronic pain experience literally different. It looks different in the brain. It looks different in the spinal cord. It even looks different out in the periphery, right? So there's that difference, and I think less and less now, speaking, scientists used to treat pain, chronic pain, as if it were acute, right? But now we're seeing, because we know that chronic pain in particular is so multifaceted, we are seeing more of this transition into a more holistic approach because of those things that you mentioned. Another thing you brought up was, I think you brought up fear and you brought up emotions, right? And that's also something that, we're really just starting to understand. I think, anytime that you think of pain, or particularly in a clinical setting, when someone asks you, well, from 0 to 10, what's your pain level right now? You are automatically bringing up memories of previous pain, right? Comparisons. Are you scared in that moment? Are you calm in that moment? All of these things color, your perception of pain in that moment. And that is something that, also, as you said, it makes it difficult to study, right? Additionally, everybody's coming at their pain experience with a variety of other life experiences, right? Like there's this intersectionality of life experiences that happen. And so it makes it also really tough to say, this chronic low back pain patient is the same as this other chronic low back pain patient, when maybe one is a female, one is a male, or one is white, or one is Black or African. And so you think, to that point, you think that it might be impossible, right, to find some sort of universal, pain metric or something. And maybe it is, but I think that technology now can start using all of these differences and actually start clustering them, right, and making sense and finding patterns in individual differences that can help us with this. And then I also think too, even though we're all dissimilar, we're also very similar, right? So the ways that our brains, yes, there's a ton of overlap. And so you can start picking up on physiological signals that are the same or very similar across different people, right? And those two things together can start making, our measurements of pain, more, I caution to say more objective, but definitely more, patient focused, less biased, these types of things.
Mm-hmm. I think one interesting example that shows, how the mind can affect levels of pain or even the absence of it are extreme situations such as people training and walking on embers and experiences like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, does that in any way help science try to understand pain? I'm sure there was research done around these experiences.
There's so much, there's people coming back from war and amputees, right? I'm a dancer, and there's been a little bit of research studied on like ballerinas, right? And if you think about how much pressure they're putting on their toes, right, that will activate nociceptors. But over time, right, they don't view it as painful because they have so many other things, right? Extremely contextual. I think being aware of that as a scientist, that when you study pain, that it doesn't occur in a vacuum, that it is always contextual, I think is super important. We always have to keep that in mind. And so, to that extent, it's helpful, right?
Mm-hmm. So, how far has science come so far in quantifying pain? So what seems to be the most useful tool or approach at the moment?
I would say, quantifying pain is going to be something we're going to be working on for a while. And each tool has its own difference in terms of like usability and feasibility, right? So I know, Tor Wager's group, he used to be at CU Boulder, but I think he's at Dartmouth now. He's done a really excellent job of using fMRI to quantify acute pain, different kinds of pain, like thermal, pressure, these types of things, even I think emotional pain. And so we have these pattern recognitions in fMRI that's able to do a really good job and to be validated in different kinds of people. In terms of chronic pain, I think that's something that is still quite a bit a ways away. But my previous lab that I was in at Northwestern University, Vanya Karian's lab, he's done a lot of work, again with fMRI, on looking at, how chronic pain is different than acute pain in the brain in real time, as well as, having biomarkers of like people that might be more likely to develop chronic pain in the future. So I think, right, in terms of, but the problem with fMRI and those types of things is that they're expensive, they're cumbersome, right? They're not easily translatable to a market. And so that kind of leaves us with a different territory of like using wearables or using other sensors in the environment. And I think that people are getting closer to being able to do this, but we still have to do, a lot more research on this.
So all this is happening more or less in the research space, because given everything that you just described, research is done with very different instruments. And if you imagine a medical setting where a patient comes to the doctor's office and suffers from pain and says that, obviously the doctor is not going to do all sorts of research and fMRIs and everything just to decide
Mm.
what kind of treatment the patient is going to get. So how
Mm-hmm.
does the research translate into clinical
Yeah.
practice?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things we're working on at IBM is kind of to this point, developing this sort of like digital health, like ecosystem or platform that kind of addresses some of these questions. So the first is, right, and we've touched on this a little bit, but pain, whether that's acute or chronic, is multidimensional. And what I mean by that is not just the fact that it is, psychological and physiological and cultural, but also that it's not just about pain intensity or pain location, right? It's also just as much about mood and sleep and activity and these types of like quality of life measures. And so, one of the things that we want to do is we want to take tools that already exist, put them in one place and make them usable for a physician, like in a clinical setting, right? Work with physicians, provide them with access to these types of tools or algorithms that then they can use and translate into practice. Now, again, right, this is still in development, but I think that's kind of one way of like approaching something like this to make sure that you go from research and development into actual, practice.
Mm-hmm. One interesting study that you did was the use of placebo in maybe substituting medications in some cases with placebo because it works in some people. So, can you tell me a little bit more about that? What was the trigger for such a research? Did the
Mm,
opioid crisis in the US had any role in it?
mm. Right. So just to be clear, we weren't actually like trying to replace placebos with something else. So my previous work, again, this is with Northwestern University. We were just interested in the placebo response from a mechanistic standpoint, right? Because it's fascinating. And so we actually got an NIH grant to study placebo specifically. So we had a clinical trial, registered clinical trial that gave the majority of patients placebos as a primary treatment. We had a very small number, less than 10 patients received an active standard of care. And the only reason we did that was so that we could be blinded, that there was always a chance, right, that someone would have received an active treatment. And we were really interested in discovering, is there any predictive factors, right? Whether that's based in the brain, personality, other types of things that can reliably infer if someone's going to respond to this or not, and to what extent they will, right? So that was kind of the main goal or aim of that previous research. And what we ended up finding, right? And there's a couple papers that I've published on this. One, we found that there are certain brain networks and associated personality characteristics that are predictive of response before they even get a pill. And then we also found that other characteristics of the brain change in response to getting a pill. And then finally, we found that there are certain ways that people talked about their pain experiences overall that were also, predictive. I shouldn't say predictive. They inferred whether or not someone would be a placebo responder or not, right? So the idea wasn't really fostered by any ongoing, opioid crisis or anything like that. It was more of a research question, but obviously the implications for that are really substantial.
So you mentioned that people talked differently about pain, and that was really helpful. Can you elaborate that a little bit further? So how did
Sure.
the descriptions differ?
Yeah. So originally we wanted to do, so the whole idea behind even using language as a marker was, we really see language as a window into the mind, right? So it's both a consequence of thought, but it's also a cause of thought. And so the idea is if pain is in the mind, then how you think about pain should affect how you talk about pain. And maybe we can tease that apart in someone's language and the associated placebo response. So to that, we were originally going to do an interview at the beginning of the study, but there's a lot of literature to suggest that even just asking people about their pain experiences can elicit placebo or nocebo responses, right? Because it hinges the social dynamic and even expectations. So for the first study, which is the one that's published, we actually waited until the exit interview. And then that's why I corrected myself earlier, because then it's not predictive anymore. But we essentially asked patients a variety of things that weren't really even about their time in the study, right? We asked them, tell me about yourself. What do you like to do? Tell me about a dream you had recently. And then we also asked them about, how's your pain experience been so far? Like, when did it start? Like, what are some previous experiences you've had in the medical system? This type of thing. And what we discovered was that there was very clear distinctions between the people that responded to placebo and the people that didn't. And we were blind at the time. We didn't know who did or didn't until later. And this really had to do with issues of like identity and self, and also like leisure activities. And I think that it was kind of surprising as well that we found relationships between people's perceptions of like stigma and language and placebo. So it was a first study that kind of was able to actually tease apart responders and non-responders in terms of language. What's interesting is that we have a study coming up, it's not published yet, but hopefully this year, that actually takes that language model and it applies it to data that's unseen at the beginning of a study to actually predict future responders or non-responders. So we think that the are actually also predictive, which is really cool.
And to which extent did you also look at or didn't look at the voice as such? So, because you really dive into the context, but a lot of
Yes.
research is also done on, how the person speaks. I know that sometimes if I listen my previous episodes, I'm annoyed because I can hear, the different mood that I was in when doing
Yeah.
different interviews.
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. So for that particular study, we didn't look at it. But I think, I can comment on that in general. So, obviously we have the acoustic properties of voice, which can give us a hint at emotionality in particular, as you just mentioned. But also, it can give us a hint at like other cognitive differences or happening, right? Like speech rate and such. It's important. I think the reason why we didn't study it was just because we didn't have the equipment at the time to do that in a reasonable way. But I think there's that interaction as well between the acoustics of what you say and the content of what you say, right? And if you mix all of those together, that's where you probably get the best signal for these types of things. Going back to what we talked about earlier is it's tough with chronic pain, right? So with acute pain, particularly with acoustics, right, you might imagine that your pitch might get higher if you're in more pain or something like this. Or alternatively, you might actually have less verbal or even less sounds coming because it is such an intense experience, right, in acute pain. With chronic pain over time, because people become so used to it, finding those differences and inflections or even content becomes a lot more, difficult of a challenge. So it's something that, we acknowledge, we're still looking at, but it's definitely a factor. Both of those are.
I'm probably gonna ask you a few times over the conversation, how
Yeah.
applicable is this to the clinical practice? Because everything that we mentioned, looking at how somebody is speaking, what's the tone of voice, that's very interesting for the research space. But I wonder, to which
Yeah.
extent can that help a doctor?
Yeah. Well, I think, right, if you think about it, people are already doing that. So let's if we take a step back and we don't say like a pain, physician, but we take a psychologist, right? Psychologists, as part of the psychiatric interview, are already, looking at these things. It's part of their natural way of interacting with a patient. And I'm assuming, and I'm not a pain physician, but I'm assuming that this is also part of what they are listening to, even if they're not really consciously aware of it. So I think what essentially a tool like that would do is it would be able to make visible the things that they already kind of inherently know, right? Or it can also help them, check biases in certain ways, right? If they're hearing something that the algorithm wouldn't be, for example, or vice versa. So I think it has direct clinical implication, and I think it's also one of the few things too, as we said before, it's costly and burdensome to have to always put somebody in MRI, right? But if you could simply, in the future, record somebody's voice or your conversation with that person, and you would know some sort of likelihood, in the future, I think that is it's minimally burdensome. It's actually part of like a natural process that happens in the clinic anyway. But that's just, my personal opinion.
Yeah. When it comes to placebo, it's used in clinical trials to kind of help determine the efficacy of medications.
Mm-hmm.
So, a new medication has to be definitely better than a placebo effect. But what does that tell us, the existence of placebo and also nocebo on the other hand, so
Mm-hmm.
having a negative effect without actually having a reason for that, that's maybe not the best
Mm-hmm.
explanation,
Yeah.
but it's just so the opposite of placebo when you suffer from negative consequences
Yep.
because you think that something is hurting you. How does all that help us in kind of making medical practice better? Because when you were
Mm-hmm.
researching pain, you came to interesting conclusions around who is going to respond to placebo or not, so that a little bit indicates that potentially some people could just get a placebo to get better. um,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously that also brings with it a lot of ethical questions. Is it ethical to basically give somebody a placebo when they're thinking that they're actually getting a drug?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a lot in there. Let me first start with just in case people listening don't know what that difference is. So placebo is kind of this catch-all term, for expectation, right? So I kind of, and it can be positive, which would be placebo, or it could be negative, which would be nocebo. And so traditionally, as you've mentioned, in clinical trials, right, randomized control trials, you have a control group, which often receive, sometimes they receive treatment, but usually there's a placebo control group. And then there's some sort of active treatment group, and it's randomized, right? The thing that people don't understand, or maybe they don't think about, is that placebo, if it's about expectation, right, for us, as opposed to getting a sugar pill or not, placebo responses or nocebo responses, expectation responses, are in every single medication, therapy, treatment that any of us use, right? No matter what. And so there's going to be a number of people that are randomly assigned to an active treatment group who would be placebo responders, right? Statistically speaking. And so what something like this, and I say that because they're likely to respond no matter what was given to them, right? And so if you have a group of people like that already in your active treatment group, then you're already in some ways biasing, the treatment of many tools that are able to somehow indicate likelihood of placebo response could do is it could identify those people ahead of time and make sure that those groups are equally stratified between, the two arms, for example. And so that then makes clinical trials, more likely to be accurate. These types of things. That's just one, example. I think the other kind of, I don't know if it's a misconception, but I think there is a misconception that placebo is always deceptive. And I think that comes in part because of the history of placebo, because it has traditionally been associated with deception. But there's a ton of research showing that you can get the same benefits from open label placebo. So when people actually know that they are taking some sort of sugar pill, right, or sham treatment. And that's, I think, primarily coming from like Ted Kaptchuk's work. But, I think there's a way that you can use placebo response to actually, benefit and make, clinical trials and even like clinical practice, like more efficient, right? And more patient centric. So, the ethics involved are important, but I think that, we can think about this in a way that is actually really, beneficial for everybody involved.
The more I think about it, the more I feel that it's really difficult, to study the effects of placebo, because if you have somebody who's in terrible pain and it's a chronic pain, and he has this very strong desire that to get better, and then when that person gets a drug, even if it was the same drug as before, I can imagine that, being a chronic patient, you can still have a strong desire that
Mm.
this drug is going to help you this time, even if it didn't last time.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it possible that in the first case, placebo was not there, and in the second case, it is? And, you know, there comes the question, can the treatment be even more successful for an individual if you combine the actual efficacy of the drug
Mm.
combined with placebo on top of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think more research done to disentangle the placebo or expectation effects from drugs that we use, right? Is this additive? Is it multiplicative? How stable is it, right, in time? So, more research needs to be done there because they are all, imbued together, right? To your point, uh, to study. So I think one of the reasons why it has been so hard is that traditionally, before, I would say, primarily studied in otherwise healthy patients who have no history of like chronic illness, right? And that's problematic because you end up bringing people who have very different expectations of treatment and various and different experiences with prior treatment to that setting, right? And so a lot of the predictive models or just even theory behind placebo and even personality of placebo was really biased towards healthy people. But then when you have a chronic person, whether that's someone or a person with a chronic condition who has, let's say, chronic pain, or let's say they have depression, they're already coming into a situation with expectations based off of prior experiences, which changes the types of things we might expect, to be factors in future response. So I think, the way that research is heading now, we're kind of eliminating some of those old tendencies and biases, which is good. But I think there's still more work to do. And I think the other thing too is that, and this, is speaking, from my experience, is that there tends to be this kind of internal discussion about whether or not placebo response is a trait, so something that is reliable and stable in time, or if it's a state, so something that is totally dependent upon where the person is. I tend to view it as a mix of both, right? So I think that our various experiences, what we've learned about our bodies or pain or, whatever it is, right, whatever condition we have, mixed with whatever circumstances are happening at that time, puts us along some sort of continuum, right? It might make us more or less likely to respond to something, but that doesn't mean that we can't respond to it in the future, right? So I think like there's a flexibility there, to your example, where it is possible that that person may have actually had an inclination to respond, but because of all the factors surrounding that initial, application of treatment, but that's right. There was enough of the right factors that pushed that response to happen.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, sounds like so many variables that I wonder, how do you even set standards, to be able to do research and compare results and studies? So
Mm-hmm.
perhaps if we go back to the study that you did, so it was about how speech to text AI could help doctors prescribe a placebo to ease chronic pain. so you focused on speech.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, how, given how difficult it is to set standards, what were your hypotheses there? What did you expect? How was the study designed in the first place?
Right. So I think we touched a little bit on this before. So I guess before going into that, your comment about standards is interesting. I think, in order to set standards, you have to show and you have to demonstrate multiple times the ability that something works and works in a variety of populations, right? So in our case, right, we had a very specific population. So we were looking at individuals with chronic low back pain. So they had to have back pain for at least 6 months. They also had to have some sort of neuropathic component, meaning that they felt it, not just in their back, but also probably radiating down one or both legs. And we were also, even though we included a wide variety of people, so we had people age 20 up to, I think, 70 something. And, we had men and women. We had actually a equal number or a representative number of Caucasian, Hispanic, and African Americans in our study. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that our model not only applies again on a very similar population, but also applies on a different pain population or multiple different pain populations. You might need to think about how it applies to different kinds of treatment. So we were using a pill, but placebo responses might change if you use an injection or you use a surgery, this type of thing. And then also, how the models change with different populations or even different languages, right? So there's so much that needs to be done to develop a standard of practice and care. And I think that just because there's a lot that needs to be done doesn't mean that it can't be done, right? It's just that you have to be really, cognizant of all of those things. In terms of the actual, design, we were really careful to not put an actual expectation onto the participant. So we wanted them to kind of have their own placebo, or nocebo, or null like response. So a lot of times what you'll see in placebo responses is they'll say, this is going to help you, right? And so you're essentially like setting up that positive expectation bias. And we really didn't want to do that. We wanted to see where patients would naturally go. So we said, you may or may not receive an active treatment. It may or may not help you. It has helped some people in the past. Sometimes it hasn't. And we were trying to be as honest also as possible. So both of those statements were true, and they didn't, lead, anyone on. Everything was doubly blinded, right? So I had no idea as I was interacting with patients what they were assigned to. They didn't have any interaction or knowledge of what they were assigned to throughout the entirety of the study. We even did something that was actually quite onerous on the researchers' part, which was we actually triple blinded the data analysis. So when everything was done, we actually had a real data set and 2 fake data sets. So we had to repeat everything 3 times to see if if our model results were by chance or if they are actually really robust, right? So we were trying to be very responsible and ethical in how we were doing it the whole time.
You mentioned that you were very mindful regarding the population that was involved, and diversity is currently a huge topic also when it comes to clinical trials and how,
Mm-hmm.
which population our devices
Yeah.
tested on. So, did you notice any differences based on race and pain?
We did not. Nope. We did not notice any differences in terms of race, education level, income, any of that. But it was a small population. And, we didn't design the study to look at those things. We just made sure that they weren't factors in our results that we got, or at least I should rephrase that, apparent factors in the results that we got. But to your point, right, disparities in healthcare and in particular, pain is a big deal. At least, I can only comment on it from the US. I don't know, honestly, if it is, in Slovenia. But I think, there's differences in prescribing opioid medications based off of race. There's differences in the amount of prescriptions based off race and gender. And these are these are problems. It has, real world consequences. And so I think, this is something that has to be tackled, not just from a research aspect, by making, I was lucky enough to be part of an environment that having that data set be as inclusive and representative as possible was actually something we thought about. But as researchers, as clinicians, we need to do more of that. And it's a tough thing, right? Because at least in the US, we have, a historical disenfranchisement and, not even just bias, but mistreatment of people within a research and clinical, context. So there's more than just getting the data. It's also fostering trust in that process too, which I think is important, which we need a lot more work on.
Yeah, again, a lot of factors. It's definitely, a vast, a huge, and fascinating field which you have been researching for a very long time. And in that time, in the last 10, 20 years, a lot of progress has happened also in the field of technology that's used to kind of help and curb pain. So, given your background in neuroscience and psychology, I really wonder, how do you see, the digital therapeutics that are now coming out, the focus on mindfulness, uh, on meditation, and all
Mm,
the cognitive,
mm,
basically, exercises to kind of help pain.
yeah.
And on the other hand, there's VR that shows that if you have naive patients that have not been exposed to VR before, there's quite a good chance that they're going to react like immediately, at least
Mm-hmm.
in the first treatment.
Yeah. So I'm personally really excited about this. Again, if it's done responsibly. But I think, the advent of digital technologies, and particularly, technologies that combine this cognitive aspect that you're hinting at with patient behaviors, I think is super important, right? I'm seeing a lot more. Tons of apps are trying to measure, people intensity and such. More, but what is new is what you're getting at is actually giving people back suggestions of how they can themselves, control their pain, right? And I think that's one of these things that I think why I liked placebo so much is because it kind of lets people into their own bodies and minds and actually be able to control some parts of the pain, not all of it themselves. And I think so much of suffering in general is because of this perceived lack of control. So being able to download an app and get feedback, either in the form of some sort of, digital suggestion, or even a lot of these apps are coming with health coaches, right? So that there's this really good social aspect in there that I think is useful, because especially with a clinical condition, you don't really want people to feel ostracized or alone in this process, right? You want it to be social and dynamic. I think too, and this goes back to some of the work that IBM is doing, with many partners like Boston Scientific, is, this digital health platform also is allowing now physicians to be able to, and clinicians and such, to be able to, use data that isn't just coming from the clinic, but is coming from people's real world experiences, right? In their lived environments, where they're more likely to show real fluctuations in what's going on. And so then you essentially can help physicians kind of triage, right? And be able to say, this person, I want to reach out to this person, or I can better understand what this person is going through. So I really am a big fan of it. I think too, it's building on a lot of the research that was already done, right? So for VR, I immediately think of V.S. Ramachandran's work on the mirror box, right? Where you have a person who has phantom limb pain and they put their one hand into a box, but then that's mirrored so that they can see what would have been their missing limb in the other, and they feel relief, right? It's kind of like the first form in some ways of a virtual reality. And so I think, as we start progressing along that lines, VR is a potential new therapy for pain. That's really exciting, super exciting.
Mhm. To which extent do you see that clinicians are skeptical about all these approaches and the research that's done, because when it comes to AI, one of the real concerns is that it's not introduced properly into the clinical
Mm,
settings. So clinicians are just given new
mm,
tools and told that they work, and then clinicians wonder,
yeah.
but yeah, but what's the data set, like how does this
Mm,
algorithm
mm,
work? Can I rely on this?
yeah.
I'm responsible for this patient. Why would I
Hmm.
trust this AI? And when you've got all sorts of vendors and providers that are using different measures and different data set, and it's difficult to compare
Yeah.
the solutions. What's your experience working with clinicians regarding these
Yeah.
questions?
So it's a really good point. I think a lot of those issues, not all of them, but a lot of them can be circumvented if you work with them from the get-go, right? So, we have this partnership with Boston Scientific, and we're working with people who are not just part of the business side of Boston Scientific, but clinicians that work with spinal cord stimulators. We're working with people who actually program the stimulators. And so then as you are designing this and figuring out, well, what should we measure? What are the clinical standards for this? You can how would it be usable? Like, as a physician, what would you need in order to be able to trust this? When you can have those conversations up front, right, then you don't run into those issues that you mentioned, right? And it also allows you kind of to design with inclusivity in mind to a certain extent, right? So different physicians might value different metrics over others, and so how do you make sure you account for that in the products that you're building? So I think it's that and along the lines too of something that IBM really values is like trust and transparency. So getting away from that kind of black box approach and being able to have, if your algorithm makes some sort of decision or prediction, like having it available for why it made that, so that people can understand it, right? It's approachable. It's not just, oh, this told me to do that, therefore I did it, right? Because clinical decision making has to work in synergy with the tools that we develop. It can't be separate, and one can't trump the other either.
Hmm. I want to quote the blog post that you wrote about part of the research that you did, and that was, when we talked to the speech to AI tools that would help doctors in the future. A standardized list of patient-related questions given to patients during a visit could potentially be automatically transcribed to the AI and analyzed in real time to provide a physician the likelihood of that patient's response to a prescribed treatment. It sounds amazing, but
Mm-hmm.
how far do you think we still are from that kind of scenario?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a researcher. I hate deadlines. So I can't give you a concrete thing of how far we are. I can tell you what we still need to do, right? So, and I've touched on this briefly, in the conversation, but the very first thing we need to do is does this work again in a similar population, which is something that I can say as yes, it does, but we need to finalize that research and publish it. And then we need to say, okay, how specific or global do we need to be? Do we want this to be something, because right now the model is tested on a very specific type of pain and a very specific type of placebo, right? A pill. And so we want to go, okay, does this also work on other kinds of populations? Does it also work on other kinds of treatment? And then, because this is a language model, does this also work in different languages, right? And I think that is super important. I also think too, the language models that we used, we have to make sure that they are the least bias as possible. There's a lot of data coming out now about like NLP bias and things like this. And so we need to make sure that like we're not accidentally introducing more of that into our studies. So I think a lot of validation analysis need to happen before we see something like that be out in the clinic and usable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I would sum up this, I would just say that as with any other AI research or AI tool, it's always very, very narrow and very difficult to kind of translate into a different setting or to different population, because yeah, we have to be
Mm-hmm.
mindful that, what the focus of the study was.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, Sarah, thank you for this insight, and hopefully the future is gonna be less painful. That's the only thing that I can say.
Or, it'll be, to that point, it's like pain is useful, right? It's just when we have too much of it and we can't adapt to it, that's when it becomes problematic. So, maybe it's not necessarily about less pain, but about pain that we can actually, make sense of. So
Yeah, great point. Great point. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome.